HOA sued me for a 2-inch fence violation, so I bought their law firm. I've lived in Windmere Grove for 4 years, long enough to know that the real power in this community isn't elected. It's whispered, passed in glances at committee meetings, hidden in HOA newsletters with passive-aggressive reminders. And lately, that power had a name: Bradley Kent. Bradley was the type of man who measured his self-worth by the length of his lawn and the number of HOA violations he could hand out before brunch. Unfortunately for him, I was not your average resident. My name's Dana Harper. I'm an architect, I work from home, and I read contracts for fun. So when I opened my mailbox one humid Thursday morning and found an official violation notice stating that my backyard privacy fence exceeded regulation height by exactly 2 inches, I laughed. Then I read it again. Then I didn't laugh anymore. 2 inches. Apparently, my 6-foot fence, the same one that had been there when I bought the house, was now non-compliant and visually disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic. According to the notice, I had 10 days to remove or replace the entire fence, or face a $1,000 fine and legal escalation. Legal escalation. Over 2 inches. I stood there gripping the paper, my coffee forgotten and growing cold in my hand. I wasn't just being warned, I was being challenged. And I had a very strong suspicion about who was behind it. Bradley had never liked me. Maybe it was the fact that I'd beaten him in last year's community design contest. Maybe it was the fact that I didn't play nice at the HOA meetings, that I asked uncomfortable questions. Whatever it was, I knew this wasn't about offense. This was about control. And Bradley Kent was about to find out what happens when you try to bulldoze a woman who designs buildings for a living. The next HOA meeting was that Sunday. I showed up 5 minutes early, dressed in a sharp navy blazer and armed with a copy of the HOA covenant, the one I'd annotated line by line the night before. I sat near the front, just close enough to make eye contact with Bradley Kent when he walked in. His smirk faltered the moment he saw me. Good. As the meeting droned on, budget updates, garden club announcements, a bizarre suggestion about standardized patio furniture, I waited. Then, item 7B hit the agenda: fence violation and pending legal action. My fence, my case. Bradley cleared his throat. Due to persistent noncompliance, he began, the board has voted to proceed with formal legal action regarding Miss Harper's property. No one even looked at me. They just nodded like robots. I'd like to speak, I said. Bradley raised an eyebrow. This isn't a Q&A session. I'm not asking. I stood. My voice was steady, but it sliced through the silence like glass. What you're doing is not enforcement. It's targeted harassment. My fence has stood unchallenged for years. Until now. Why? Murmurs broke out. A few neighbors looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. Per our covenants, Section 14.3 states any structural complaint must be filed within 90 days of observation. The fence has been there 4 years. And by the way, that anonymous complaint from last month, I turned and looked straight at Bradley. I traced it. You filed it yourself. The room snapped awake. Bradley turned red. That's completely unsubstantiated. I have the email metadata, I replied coolly. Spoofing HOA inboxes through Gmail aliases isn't just unethical, it's legally questionable. But sure, let's talk about escalation. That shut him up. I didn't expect to win the room, not yet, but seeds were planted. And as I walked out of that stuffy clubhouse, I knew 2 things. Bradley would double down. I needed leverage. That night, I opened a bottle of wine, logged into the county court's public access portal, and started reading every HOA-related lawsuit Windmere Grove had filed in the last 5 years. It was more than I expected. Every single one of them, from tree trimming disputes to driveway resurfacing, had been handled by the same boutique law firm, Kent, Adler, and Booth. My lips curled into a smile. Guess who was about to do a little shopping? I spent the next 2 days in a rabbit hole of legal filings, billing records, and HOA meeting minutes. A digital paper trail of how power operates in places like Windmere Grove. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became. Bradley's kingdom was built on predictability. Same firm, same tactics, same threats. He controlled the board through intimidation and a tiny army of outsourced muscle-wearing suits. And that muscle, it all funneled back to Kent, Adler, and Booth, a local boutique law firm operating out of a mid-rise suite across from the courthouse. They billed exclusively for HOA litigation, and 80% of their contracts came from this very neighborhood and the ones nearby. But here's what made my spine straighten. The firm had just gone through a quiet internal shift. Adler, the A in cab, had retired 2 months ago. Booth was managing family health issues and had been on sabbatical since February. That left the firm's remaining equity partner, Glenn Kent, Bradley's younger cousin. It was almost poetic. The firm had been limping financially, according to the records I found through a friend in the real estate sector. They were running thin, over-leveraged on staff, downsizing office space, and recently lost a major client due to mishandling a zoning lawsuit. In plain English, they were vulnerable. And that's when the idea became something more than a fantasy. It became a plan. The next morning, I put on a gray blazer, tied my hair back, and drove to their office pretending to be someone looking for representation. The receptionist barely looked up as I signed in. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Glenn Kent himself, mid-40s, balding, tired-looking, and exactly the type who believed women like me only ever asked for discounts or divorces. I smiled politely. I'm researching legal counsel for an HOA case. Very small, I said, folding my hands neatly. But I'm also looking for something long-term. Corporate strategy, possibly real estate. Glenn leaned forward slightly. Residential, commercial. I lied smoothly. But I've recently inherited a few properties that need managing, and I'm building a portfolio. I want a team with flexibility, one I could invest in, or even acquire partially. He blinked. Acquire? Not officially, I said with a shrug. But firms like yours don't come along often. HOA specialization, clean record, solid regional presence. The right investor could do a lot with that. Glenn didn't know who I was, and I didn't plan to tell him, not until it mattered. 3 weeks later, the deal was done. Through a holding company my financial advisor helped me establish, I acquired 51% controlling interest in Kent, Adler and Booth, under the guise of future restructuring. Glenn got the cash injection he so desperately needed. His staff kept their jobs, and I got full access to every HOA contract his firm had, including Windmere Grove's. And wouldn't you know it, Bradley had never properly ratified the retainer. The last contract update was 3 years old, unsigned by the current board, and technically invalid. That meant every action taken by Glenn's team under that assumed agreement, legally ungrounded. I let that marinate for a week. Then, I scheduled a firm-wide meeting. I want all active HOA accounts placed on review, I said, standing at the head of the conference table. Windmere Grove goes to the top of the list. I'll be leading that case personally. Glenn looked up, startled. I thought we were closing that one out, your fence case. My fence case, I echoed, letting the words hang in the air. Glenn, you never asked my name when we met. He blinked again. I could practically see the gears grinding behind his eyes. My name is Dana Harper, and your firm has been threatening to sue me on behalf of a board member who isn't even authorized to retain you. Silence. I now own controlling interest in this firm, which means you work for me, which means you're going to draft a letter stating that due to a lapse in contractual authority, Kent, Adler, and Booth is withdrawing legal representation from Windmere Grove HOA immediately. You can't, I can, I said simply, and I just did. He stood up, face red. This is insane. No, I replied. What's insane is using legal threats to punish residents over fence heights and bird feeders while your own paperwork is incomplete. What's insane is bullying your neighbors and thinking no one will ever fight back. I have family on that board, and I had hydrangeas along my fence line until your cousin decided I was his next project. We all lose things, Glenn. He didn't speak for a long time. Eventually, he sank back into his seat and stared at the table. I suggest you inform Mr. Kent that he'll need to find another firm to weaponize, I said, gathering my notes. And while you're at it, draft a cease and desist. No further action regarding my fence or property is to be taken under penalty of counter-litigation. Glenn didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message had landed. That night, I poured myself a glass of red wine, walked out to my newly painted and still 6-foot-tall fence, and stared at the stars. Bradley had built an empire on quiet fear and unchecked control, and I had just bought his army out from under him, one signature at a time. The email went out on a Thursday morning. Plain, professional, deadly. To whom it may concern, due to unresolved contractual deficiencies and a conflict of interest discovered during a routine review, Kent, Adler, and Booth will no longer be representing the Windmere Grove Homeowners Association in any legal capacity, effective immediately. Regards, Dana Harper, acting managing partner by noon. My phone was buzzing not with threats, but with whispers. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to were forwarding me screenshots, forwarding each other rumors. No one knew exactly what was happening yet, but they all felt it. Something had cracked. At 3:07 p.m., I received my first official response from Bradley himself. Subject, clarification requested. Dana, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to schedule a call to resolve the current tension between yourself and the HOA. Regards, Bradley Kent, HOA President Tension. The first smiled at the screen. I didn't respond. The next HOA meeting was unusually packed. Every chair in the rec center was filled. The air buzzed with the kind of tension you usually only feel before a thunderstorm. Bradley walked in late, flanked by 2 board members, and looking like a man walking into a courtroom, not a community potluck. I waited until the new business segment before raising my hand. Bradley hesitated. Miss Harper, 2 things, I said, standing. First, I'd like the board to acknowledge receipt of my attorney's letter ending legal representation between this HOA and Kent, Adler, and Booth. Murmurs. Eyebrows. Bradley coughed. Yes, we've received some communication. Some? I echoed, pulling out printed copies. I have 3 certified mail confirmations, email delivery receipts, and the firm's posted withdrawal on their public site. I'm happy to distribute them. He didn't answer. I handed them out anyway. Second, I continued, I'd like clarification from the board as to why legal action was being pursued over a fence that predated my purchase of the home and was approved under the 2018 development agreement. That lit the room on fire. I didn't need to finish. The gears were already turning. Miss S. Langley from Birch Lane, the same woman who once threatened to report me for wind chimes too whimsical, raised her hand. Wait, you were approved for that fence? I turned, meeting her eyes. Not only was it approved, it was built as part of the original developer installation. The violation was based on new measurements taken by someone on the board without a permit or survey and pursued without a valid legal contract. Bradley's face went pale. Is this true? Someone else asked. Then another. I think we deserve answers. The room, once loyal or indifferent, turned. Just like that. The spell broke. And for the first time since moving into Windmere Grove, I saw fear in Bradley Kent's eyes. The next day, I got an unexpected visit. Knock, knock. I opened the door to find Bradley's wife, Cheryl, standing stiffly on my porch in tennis whites and oversized sunglasses, the kind of woman who treated bake sales like Olympic events. Dana, she said tightly, do you have a moment? I considered slamming the door, but I was raised better than that. Of course, I said, stepping aside. She didn't sit, just stood in the entryway like someone trying not to breathe in my less than pine-scented air. Bradley's under a lot of pressure, she began. You've made your point. But he's still president of the HOA and a respected member of this community. These public theatrics, I cut in. You mean the ones your husband started when he weaponized the bylaws to punish a resident over a fence? Her lips pursed. He's a proud man, she said after a pause. He doesn't respond well to humiliation. I raised an eyebrow. He should have thought about that before trying to embarrass me. A long silence stretched. Finally, she adjusted her sunglasses. Just don't make this worse than it has to be. And with that vague threat disguised as diplomacy, she left. But it was already getting worse. For him. Because the board had called an emergency review session, and word was spreading that multiple residents were now asking for a vote to remove Bradley as president. And when they asked for a volunteer to review the HOA bylaws for misuse of enforcement, guess who got nominated? Yours truly. By the end of the week, I'd been voted in as temporary compliance advisor, the irony not lost on anyone. Bradley tried to block it. He failed. His allies were jumping ship faster than a sinking yacht. Then came the cherry on top. As part of my review, I requested a financial audit. Nothing aggressive, just a routine wellness check, as I called it. But my real goal? I wanted to see just how much personal favoritism had made its way into community spending, and boy, did it. Bradley had authorized $12,000 Stowe community landscape upgrades, which turned out to be stonework around his own pool. Over $3,500 in miscellaneous administrative reimbursements, tied to gift cards and restaurant expenses often to places Bradley and Cheryl frequented. And worst of all, a $7,800 charge listed as legal prep for future litigation, dated a week before I received my fence violation. I gathered it all into a neat, chronological PDF titled Summary of findings, Windermere HOA spending irregularities. And I copied the board and the neighborhood and the county compliance office. That night at 11:22 p.m., I received a single text from an unknown number. Congratulations, Dana. You've made your point. You win. B, I turned off my phone, walked out onto my porch, and looked at my fence. Still standing. Still 6 feet tall. And now, a symbol of something bigger. They wanted to make an example out of me. Instead, I made an example out of them. Bradley Kent resigned at the next meeting. No dramatic speech. No fake smiles. Just a quiet, clipped announcement that he was stepping back to focus on family matters, followed by a few nods and polite claps from the room. But I saw the look in his eyes, the hollow stare of a man who'd been outmaneuvered at his own game. He didn't even look at me as he left. I wish I could say I didn't enjoy it, but I did. A little. With Bradley gone, the tone of the HOA shifted fast. The new interim president, a retired civil engineer named Lucille Tran, was firm, but fair. She brought professionalism instead of politics, clarity instead of control, and she had no interest in targeting neighbors over the shade of their patio umbrellas. We formed a bylaw review committee. Guess who chaired it? In 3 months, we rewrote half the code, including a clear, enforceable process for approving or rejecting structural changes, a mandatory signature clause requiring the entire board's consent before issuing legal threats, and most importantly, a resident's right to challenge any violation with third-party mediation before fees or penalties were imposed. I also drafted and passed a new rule. No HOA funds may be spent on legal action unless the dispute exceeds $5,000 in property damage or the resident poses a demonstrable safety threat. Goodbye, weaponized micromanagement. But the story didn't end with rules. 2 months after Bradley's resignation, I received a letter from a local attorney. A class action suit had been filed against Kent, Adler, and Booth by multiple HOA communities claiming improper representation and unethical billing. The very practices I had uncovered during my review. They were building the case. They wanted my documentation. I sent it gladly. Glenn Kent, for his part, sold his remaining shares in the law firm and moved out of state. I kept my controlling interest but renamed the company. We rebranded as Harper & Steele, pivoted away from HOA work, and focused instead on pro bono advocacy for homeowners in HOA disputes. Let's just say the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Sometimes I'd walk through Windermere Grove and still feel the ghost of what used to be, the whispered threats, the fear of a wrongly placed flower pot, the dread of a letter in the mailbox. But it was fading. The neighborhood was lighter now. More neighbors smiled. More kids played freely. Fewer people felt watched. One afternoon, I found a small envelope on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a note, handwritten in careful script. Dana, I didn't agree with everything you did, but you did something no one else had the courage to. Thank you. A neighbor. It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. The fence, still there. Unchanged. Unbothered. Untouched. Sometimes I'd lean against it with a mug of coffee, watching birds nest in the branches above it, my feet resting in the exact place Bradley once threatened to dig up. It had become more than wood and nails. It was a reminder that the rules are only as powerful as the people enforcing them, and that silence is the soil where abuse grows. I'd made noise. And because of that, things had changed. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at a local housing law conference in Sacramento. Topic: HOAs, homeowners, and the power of standing up. I shared my story, not the revenge fantasy parts, not the drama, just the truth, that when we stop accepting control disguised as community standards, when we stop allowing power to hide behind protocol, we reclaim the neighborhoods we live in. A woman in the front row raised her hand after my talk. What would you say to someone who doesn't have your resources? She asked. Who can't buy a law firm or fight back like that? I thought about it. I'd say this, I replied. You don't need a law firm. You need a paper trail. You need allies. You need a voice. And most of all, you need to stop apologizing for defending your own space. Start small. Document everything. Speak once, then twice, then louder. The audience clapped. Some stood. I smiled, stepped down, and shook hands with a man who asked if I'd consider consulting for a neighborhood in San Jose. I said I'd think about it. That night, I got home late. The street was quiet. Porch lights flickered. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime tinkled gently, a little too whimsical, but no one complained anymore. I sat on my porch with a blanket and tea, staring at the stars above my unapproved 6-foot fence. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was defending my home. I had already won.